Hello and welcome to another episode of the Northern Art Podcast with me, Ant Cosgrove. Hope you're all doing well. I've been to a good number of exhibitions this year, which has been great. Highlights probably the Buffet exhibition at the Barbican, which went to a few months ago. Also managed to see the Eileen Agar exhibition at the Whitechapel in London. A couple of weeks ago, I went back to London and saw the Leon Kossoff show, which was at Annalee Judah Gallery, which was just fabulous. That's to do with a book launch that's happened recently, a catalogue raisonnaire of Leon's works, which is a huge tomb of a book. I'm also very much looking forward to seeing the Walter Sickert exhibition, which is on at the Walker Gallery in Liverpool at the moment, so hopefully we're going to see that in the next few weeks. I've been to a few contemporary art exhibitions recently, both at Manchester Art Gallery and also at Touchstones in Rochdale. I really want to go to the Oriel Mostyn, which is in Llandudno, where there's an exhibition on at the moment for the Dutch artist Jacqueline de Jong. That should be really interesting. She's not had a UK institutional exhibition in her whole career, so that should be good. If you've got any recommendations for any exhibitions, then just drop me a message and I can check them out. So, it's the moment that you've been waiting for. I'll introduce my guest today on the Northern Art Podcast. My guest today is a leading expert on the art and life of the late Welsh painter James Dickson Innes. No pressure there. Innes was born on the 27th of February 1887 and is known primarily for his stunning post-impressionistic Fauvist landscape views of Wales, as well as his friendship with the artist Augustus John. We'll learn today about Innes's life and work, and as I'm a big fan of him, I'm really looking forward to it. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to my guest today, Martin Davies. Hi, Martin. You okay?
Bore da. Hi there from Llanelli. Innes' hometown.
Yeah, this is it. This is exactly it. This is what. Well, so Martin, I've been. You do a Facebook page, don't you? Is what that's how I first sort of learned about you in particular. Yeah. I've known about Innes for many years, but I stumbled across your Facebook page a few years ago, in which you post so much amazing information about Innes and go into the places he visited and the houses and the buildings and the art, and it's a fantastic page. So I really recommend anybody listening that it is well worth checking that out. That just search on Facebook for James Dickson Innes, and I'm sure you'll find it. So when did your interest in Innes begin, in particular? And
I think it was probably around the centenary of his death in 2014. That's it.
Yeah, that's it.
2014. He died in 1914, of course. And around 2014, there was a lot of sort of activity around Innes. You know, there was a new book published by John Hoole.
Yes.
On his life and work, which is an excellent book. I thoroughly recommend. But that book came out, and I didn't even realise at the time that someone was planning a book. Although I had been in the library on occasion doing a little bit of research, and they used to say, "Oh, some guy who's been in here quite often, asking about letters and things like that." So I thought, "Oh, someone's up to something."
Yeah.
But also there was the BBC film, The Mountain That Had to Be Painted, which came out, which is an excellent film, and I recommend anybody's watched that. And you can watch that on Vimeo. Actually, it's still out there. But and then I discovered that he was actually, the family actually lived in a house just up the road from me, on the same road in Llanelli, New Road. And if you look at the house today, it's even got the date of Innes' birth on it, 1887.
Wow!
And there's a letter I between the 18 and the 87.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's just sort of garnered my interest. Who is this guy? And you kind of get sucked in then, when you see his paintings. And that's really sort of probably how it started.
I mean, it's funny because I think when you're geographically perhaps linked with an artist as well, you do sort of instantly, that does help sort of garner this personal sort of relationship. Obviously, he died, way before you were alive. But there's an artist, I live in... I was born in Middleton, which is in Manchester, in North Manchester, and there's an architect from the town I live in called Edgar Wood, and just simply because of where I live, you're driving past these houses and these unusual houses, and you're seeing them and thinking, and you start to realise that they're designed by this particular architect. He was an arts and crafts sort of style architect, a real pioneering architect as well. And so you're seeing these buildings, and then it does increase your own personal interest. And so I guess you find people who are really extremely knowledgeable about an artist sometimes will happen to live in the same town or whatever, and have got that connection with him. There's an artist called Frederick William Jackson, who was a painter and a contemporary of Edgar Wood, and so I'm fairly knowledgeable about him via these sort of links. So yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, with regards to Innes, I think my personal sort of connection with him, having listened to yours there, is I worked in Manchester, in the centre of Manchester, for 10 years, and I would go into the art gallery. It was ridiculous at one point. I was going in like 3 or 4 times a week, looking at the same paintings, and it gives you this sort of when you're looking at paintings and you're seeing them over and over again, it does help you to appreciate art so much more. And so I was going in seeing these same works, and Manchester Art Gallery is a fantastic work by Innes. I think it's Lake Bala, I think it is. It's a stunning, it's a little jewel, really, this painting. And so, I think it's still on display now. They have it on pretty much all the time on display. And then it's next to, I think there's, they have a little, maybe a trio of paintings. I think they have a Derwent Lees as well. And I definitely have an Augustus John. And it's these pictures all linked with this Welsh time that we will talk about later on. And so I would go back and it must rank as one of my favorite paintings, that just because I absolutely love it. It just sort of really spoke to me for a very long time. And like I say, I saw it so many times when I was working in Manchester. It was unbelievable. So we'll start talking about Innes, if that's okay, from the beginning of his life, and we'll see how we get on, I suppose. He was born in 1887 in Llanelli. My Welsh pronunciation is going to be awful, by the way, so apologies for anybody listening. Yeah,
at least it's not Llanelli.
Llanelli, okay.
Llanelli is what a lot of people say. But
right, okay. Which is a town in Carmarthenshire, which is in South Wales. It's not far from Swansea, I believe. So, do you know much about his early life? What was his early life like?
Well, he was actually his parents lived in Greenfield Villas in Murray Street when they first got married, and they had the three sons were born there.
John and Alice, I think, his parents. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, John Innes is actually well known in the town in any case, because he wrote quite a locally well-known book on the history of the town called Old Llanelli, which was republished a few years ago. So,
right.
And ironically, it's got nothing about his son, obviously, because his son hadn't found any fame yet. But it's quite an interesting book on the town, and it's got little things that, sort of interest when you go out for walks today. If you've read this book, it gives you little snippets to follow up on. So he was already well known because that was published in 1902. But yes, he and his wife Alice, she was actually born in Spain.
All right.
But her parents were from Liverpool. She was born in Lyon in 1857. So they got married. Alice and her mum moved to Llanelli when her father died. They'd actually moved from Spain to Oystermouth in Swansea. But when her father died, she and her mum actually moved to Greenfield Villas in Llanelli on Murray Street, where she later met John Innes. And when they first married, John moved in with Alice and her mum into Greenfield Villas.
Right.
Which is actually where there is a blue plaque dedicated to the birth of James Dickson Innes today. Okay. So they moved there, and that's where the three sons were born. Alfred George was born in 1884, Jack in 1885, and James was born in 1887. And in that same year, the family left Greenfield Villas and moved to quite a large house for that time. Well, still quite a large house, actually. A Bellan Fawr, which is at the top end of New Road, which is, about 300 yards away from me. And as I said, if you go up to the house today, they've actually got the date they moved into that house, 1887. It's on the top, just under the eaves, with the letter I between 18 and 87. So I presume that the house was actually built for the family because, he had quite a good job. I think he was involved in the customs down in the docks here. Right. But he was involved in Llanelli life anyway, John Innes. So, they moved there, and later they would move to a house in Old Road. So you've got two main roads in Llanelli, New Road and Old Road.
Right.
Original names. And so both those houses, well, the three houses actually, Greenfield Villas, Bellan Fawr and Orchard Grove, within 3 or 4 minutes walk from where I live today. So, a lot of interest was sort of garnered around that, really.
Yeah, I mean, I know. So his dad, John, and his mum as well, did show an early interest in the fact that James was interested in arts. I think they sort of helped to promote to push that, didn't they? I know. I think John was encouraged to perhaps start some sort of art group in the town, I believe, which I don't think James was a part of, but did show interest in art. And his mother, I believe, had lots of his works all around the bedroom and things like that. Is what I gather. That's what I've heard.
Yes, apparently so. The two older brothers were quite sporty footballers, and later when they went to Brecon College, they were involved in lots of sporting activities. Yeah. In fact, the only record, if you go to the archives of Brecon College, they've only got references to Alfred and Jack's achievements in the college. There's no mention of James's achievements. He was quite a sickly boy from birth, and his mum always kept a close eye on him. And in later years, wherever James moved, I mean, he never actually owned his own house. He was, I suppose, what you call today a sofa surfer. But wherever James tended to move around the country, his mum used to rent accommodation nearby.
Right, okay.
Which is quite interesting. But as you said, yes, she did, particularly in Orchard Grove House here in Old Road. Apparently it is said that, the bedrooms and some of the rooms were plastered with the works of James.
Yeah, and he painted a lot of pictures of like the local quarry, I think, didn't he, from a very young age? I gather that, I don't know if there's many of these that survived, but I think that's what I heard. There was sort of local scenes that he was painting.
There's quite a few of them survive. There's a nice oil painting of Furnace Quarry, which you can see today. It's on permanent display up in Park Howard, Llanelli. But he painted a couple of watercolours as well. I don't know whether they were preliminary sort of drawings for the oil painting, because the oil painting was done as a kind of indication of how good a painter he was, so that he could get into the Slade Art College. The students had to submit works, if you like,
of course,
to see that they were up to the certain standard. But he painted a couple of watercolours. They're owned by Carmarthenshire museums, and they sometimes bring them out on display. And it's these kind of paintings, that sort of started getting me involved in trying to find the actual locations of where Innes would have stood or sat to paint some of his scenes.
Yeah.
Which, I've posted about on the Facebook page. And, I've discovered the exact spot, really, of one of his paintings where he would have stood up at Furnace Quarry. And that was by chance, because watercolour, as you know, it's a kind of medium where the paints flow into each other.
Yeah.
But there was a certain shape in one of the watercolours. It was a kind of oblong shape. And I had a kind of rough idea of the spot where he would have painted it from. And I was on my way to work. I work in Carmarthen. But one morning the sun was shining. I thought, I'll just pull in. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning. The sun was shining at a low angle. And I popped up to the area where I thought he would have sat for this particular painting. And through the sort of sun shadows on the rocks, this oblong shape, shone out, like a diamond, really.
Yeah.
I could see that because I had a copy of the painting in front of me, that oblong shadow that I can see in front of me there and then, which you wouldn't normally see because of it was just the way the shadows of the sun were falling on it at that time in the morning, was exactly matched with the watercolour painting.
That's brilliant. I love that.
And when I had, in that painting as well, in the distance, he's got like a little old-fashioned crane.
Okay.
It looks like a quarry crane. So when I had the opportunity, perhaps a couple of weeks later, I think it was, I actually went down into the quarry. It's pretty overgrown up there.
Yeah.
Hacked away at the undergrowth. And behold, there in the undergrowth, in the same spot, was the stump of what looked like a quarry crane. So
fantastic! I love that.
And I've often wondered, it would be nice to have like that, a little plaque on that spot with a seat and that painting, just to say this is where James Dickson Innes painted this kind of painting.
That's brilliant. Yeah, and a little picture of the actual painting there, on some sort of plaque or something like that. That would be amazing.
Yeah.
I like that.
And Innes trail around the town would be.
Definitely. That's absolutely an Innes trail would be brilliant. That's a really good idea. So of course he studied in Carmarthen. He went to Carmarthen School of Art, didn't he? He was only there about a year, I believe. And he had the principal there was a guy called William Jones. I've not sort of seen too much information about that particular time, but obviously he excelled, I guess, at art at a very young age at this school.
Yeah, if you look at some of the old press cuttings from back at that period, as you said, I think it's probably less than a year when you think of the terms.
Yeah.
But you can see his name crops up for numerous little awards, watercolour, best watercolour, things like that. But there's no real detail of his time there. The Carmarthen School of Art is still there. It's called Oriel Merlin now.
Right.
And it's, there are big future developments planned for it. But you can still see the old School of Art.
Yeah, the building.
It is still there opposite the church in Carmarthen, St. Peter's Church.
Right, okay. And then he was accepted into the Slade, which was in 1905, which I guess kind of changed everything for him, and that was where the beginning really of his journey, really, of his artistic journey. I believe around that time he met. This is sort of 1905, so I think he met Derwent Lees, who was he perhaps a student there, a fellow student there at the same time? He was Australian, wasn't he? I believe
he was, and they became big friends, as you know, and even when they left Slade, they used to sort of go on little painting exhibitions together. Derwent Lees actually died sadly young as well, I think.
Yeah, he did. Was it schizophrenia? I think he had.
Yes, you mentioned that you'd seen the paintings of Augustus John.
That's right.
Innes and Derwent Lees side by side, and I think you'd accept that sort of the style of Derwent Lees in some of his paintings is remarkably similar to Innes, and John Hoole acknowledges in his book that there are quite a few paintings out there attributed to Derwent Lees, which may actually be paintings by James Dickson Innes. In fact, I think there's a cover of a book which was produced in Australia, which has got purportedly a sort of Derwent Lees painting on the front. But, John Hoole, who's, as I said, he's quite an expert on Innes' style of painting, actually thinks it is a James Dickson Innes.
Wow, that's interesting.
Painting. And Innes himself acknowledged he used to get a bit tired of the way that Derwent Lees copied his style,
Right, I didn't know that.
Painting, there are, documented sort of evidence that he used to get a bit annoyed.
Yeah, that's interesting. No, I'd like to learn more about Derwent Lees. I know a little bit about him, but certainly the fact obviously he was Australian as well is quite interesting within itself. But at the Slade, of course, Innes excelled at the Slade, and I believe he won a scholarship prize, which was really early on into his time at the Slade. That was in sort of the first year, which came to an amount of £35 per annum for the following 2 years. And based on the fact that I think the money, to do the course was £21 per annum, that obviously left a substantial amount of money left over, which was a huge thing at the time, I would imagine, at that period of time. And I gather that the family were quite well off anyway, so I would have imagined that he was perfectly fine to have been at the school. But of course, that extra money would have come in handy, and I'm sure probably bought him quite a lot of drinks. I would have thought down in the pubs in London.
Yes, he'd already sort of was moving about in the circles with Augustus John, who was a tutor at the Slade.
Yes,
I'm not sure. I think there was only about 10 years between them. So and the fact that he came from Wales as well, probably sort of, they brought them together on that basis as well, talking about the old country. But, yes, as you said, the family were quite well off because the house that they moved to, as I said, was quite a substantial house.
Yeah.
And I think at the time they owned that house, they already owned the Orchard Grove house in New Road, which they were to move in later, but at that time they were renting it out. So they were certainly a well-off.
Yeah, well, they had a maid, didn't they? For example, I believe they had a maid in the house as well. So they might have had other sort of staff as well in the house. So yeah, that sort of shows perhaps a sort of idea of perhaps the wealth that they might have had. But when Innes was there in the Slade, his main tutor, I think, or one of the tutors, was a very famous painter and teacher. Is very well known for his teaching. In fact, I called Philip Wilson Steer, who introduced, I guess, an element. I mean, he is known as kind of a British impressionist painter, and so that would have been the early influence that he would have received at that point. And so I think if you do see works, from around that period, they do show this sort of influence of Philip Wilson Steer on him.
Yes, yeah, I think so. I mean, some of the the paintings that he did kind of a bit rough and ready even then, but I mean, you don't know how many of those were intended to ever be sold. After his death, after any artist's death, people scurry around and find paintings that were just student works. They were never intended for sale. I mean, and during his life, you don't know really which works he did actually intend to be sold, because in his to Augustus John's annoyance, could churn off about 10 paintings while Augustus John was doing the same one painting. He used to sort of be well known for going out with about 10 wooden panels, which is one of his favourite ways of painting, and he'd sort of knock them off. And even during the sort of the holiday periods at the Slade. You know, he used to come back and still carry on painting local scenes in Llanelli, Kidwelly and Carmarthen. And, you know, some of them are really nice scenes, you know. I mean, and again, as I said, you know, I've enjoyed going out, trying to find the spots where he would have set up his sort of easel to paint these views. In fact, one of his, I suppose it's become a better known painting since John Hoole's found it, really, you know, when he sort of did research for his book. But he had a painting, there's a painting which is in the Beaverbrook Art Gallery in Canada. Yeah. It's just called A View of a Town, painted in 1907. When you look at it, you can see straight away, as someone from Llanelli, that it is actually a view of Llanelli, and it's probably painted from the, you know, the garden of Orchard Grove. But it's actually credited, again, we're talking about Derwent Lees, it's actually credited in the Beaverbrook Art Gallery to Derwent Lees.
Wow, okay.
Who never, there's no evidence that he would have ever come to Llanelli town. And certainly, you know, when you look at other paintings, it's more closely in the style of Innes. But it's definitely a view of Llanelli town. And you can line it up with old photographs of the town, but just sort of re-emphasize the fact that it is painted from the garden of Orchard Croft. Yeah. Did I say Orchard Lees earlier? Orchard Croft in New Road. But yes, you know, I mean...
That's interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, you'll have to contact them. I don't know if you already have, and sort of put it right.
I have emailed the curator there, and he said, you know, the response I got was, "Oh, thank you for that information. We'll just sort of keep your emails on file, but with intention of you know,
further research at some point, maybe
further research or changing the information we've already got." I did actually ask them if they would consider sort of an exchange with the National Museum Wales, so we can get these kind of paintings back, you know, to where they were actually painted. You know, I don't see the point of these paintings, you know, if they're lying in the archives, you know, they're not even on display in these galleries. If they're just lying in the archives, why don't they sort of have some exchange program with other galleries and sort of who may be more interested in actually displaying them?
Definitely. You know, that's interesting. There's a guy, do you know, there's a guy called Walter Cole. That name came up quite a bit in my research, who I think was a good friend of James. Did he live in the town? Is he somebody sort of that was a good connection of James? Do you know much about him at all?
Yes, he was a kind of his day-to-day job. He I think he was a student in the art college here.
Right.
But he became a professional painter and decorator in the town, and a kind of well-known sort of amateur artist in the town. Some of his paintings are, again, they're sort of in the local museum. And I actually, you know, I've read the letter. I think it's the only known letter between Innes and Walter Cole, where Innes is inviting Walter Cole up to London to meet some of his friends.
Right.
I think the original copy of that is in Llanelli Library. But I did actually wonder where Walter Cole was buried, and I was able to find his grave up in the local cemetery here.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I had some idea, and one day I was up there and I could see a couple of graves to the Cole family, and I found his name was right at the bottom at ground level, Walter Cole. So that's quite pleasing, sort of to link all this up.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that was obviously one of Innes's connections back to his hometown, and the fact that, like you say, he did write to him still, and sort of had association with this guy. And then after the Slade, I think this was the seminal moment for Innes, really. He did a painting trip, and he went to south of France, to Collioure, in the south of France, with John Fothergill. John Fothergill, was he a tutor at the Slade?
I think he was actually a fellow student there.
A student, right? Okay.
And as you said, he became big friends with Innes. He's quite an interesting character in himself. Yeah. He later became a sort of renowned publican and wrote some books. I think he was a bit of a sort of Basil Fawlty type character. He used to insult the locals, and possibly some have even said he might have been, you know, the sort of the idea behind Fawlty Towers. But he's quite an eccentric character, John Fothergill. He seemed to have some falling out with Innes at some point, and the letters sort of finish, you know, about 1911-12.
Yeah.
And then Fothergill himself, then he sort of didn't do much painting beyond Slade years, he sort of went into other areas. He did write an introduction to a book on James Dickson Innes, which was the forward to a book, aerial books on the arts. He used to have these little green books on artists back in the 1930s, and they produced one on James Dickson Innes, and they asked John Fothergill to do the introduction on that. But as I said, they seem to have had some falling out somewhere along the way, and there was a point where they no longer sort of wrote to each other or met each other.
Right.
That might have renewed, if Innes hadn't died so young. But John Fothergill was quite an interesting character.
Yeah, so it was 1908. They go to Collioure in south of France. Now, the interesting thing about that, Henri Matisse had been there at Collioure only sort of 3 years prior to Innes arriving there. And Matisse at that point, I think, was about age 36. And then he was joined by Derwent. And this was really this sort of, the beginnings of Fauvism, which was, it was incredible sort of moment in time where Matisse had arrived at this sort of this location and had seen the colours and the landscape, and was just sort of inspired him in sort of, it was, I mean, people talk about Fauvism as being the first sort of true, new movement of modern art in the 20th century. This is it kind of was. And so Matisse is down there painting these paintings. He went a bit crazy with regards to the amount of works he painted. It's something like 100 paintings at that time. And then of course he invited Derwent, and they came down. And so this was an incredible time. And to think that Innes was only there, it wasn't, I mean, Innes was only there, 3 years later. It wasn't like, 50 years later. It was such a short period of time after. They really almost, contemporaries really in that sort of sense. Obviously Innes was a lot younger when he went down there. But Matisse, I did find a comment on Matisse, and perhaps it does lend itself to the work of Innes, which is quite interesting. Matisse actually said, "When I put down a green, it doesn't mean it has to be grass, and when I put down a blue, it doesn't mean the sky." And I just think that was really interesting. And certainly when you see Innes's works as well, it kind of lends itself, makes me think of that as well within Innes's works. It was a fantastic sort of interesting time. And Fothergill actually said that had Innes not gone to Collioure, this is the quote from him, "We might have had in Innes just one more exponent of pale English sunshine and veiled charm. Innes tore away the veil with the brilliance of stained glass." And so, this time in Collioure, and he's seeing this sun, and he's seeing this, and he's feeling the heat. And I think it sort of inspired him and sort of shifted, created a shift in him, which obviously lasted for the rest of his career, if you like.
Yeah, well, definitely. I think, if you look at the paintings pre sort of these trips to France, the colours are sort of more muted, the kind you expect at that time. But, if you look at all the paintings, that he did sort of in the Mediterranean, sort of moorland landscape near Couloir. Couloir itself, he painted quite a few paintings of that town from the hills and, local scenes, the coast at Cerebra, all these paintings, the colours are so vibrant, and these were the colours that eventually he brought back to, when he was painting Arenig in North Wales,
exactly.
He's kind of carried on, and you can see the completely different palettes, and some of these paintings, I mean, they are amazing, as you said. When you actually see them in art galleries, as opposed to the sort of internet version, whatever, they just sort of shine out at you.
They sparkle. They really sparkle.
They do, and the way it's interesting as the way he accentuated sort of peaks and valleys. I mean, if you look at some of the views today on a photograph, you think, or is that the same view? Because, he'd make a sort of hill that looked like a mountain and whatever. But it's just the overall effect he had, and even with the skies, I mean, they're sort of paintings in themselves, But, they are sort of vibrant colours. In fact, there was quite an interesting book. I'm just looking at it now. It was written by Robert Holland last year.
Okay.
It's called The Warm South. And it's about the sort of the attraction of the the Mediterranean and along the coast there on British artists. Yeah. And the cover of the book is actually Innes's painting of Couloir.
fantastic.
There's not a lot about in the actual book itself, but the fact that he's sort of put him on the cover just tells you, you know, how good an example it is in the way that you know, the British artists, you know, their eyes were open to these, you know, the landscapes and the, you know, the colours there.
Yeah, I mean, he did visit France, as you said, several times. He did sort of various trips there. I believe so. In 1909, obviously he's back from France, and he went to St. Ives. I don't know how long he was there for. If that rings a bell, I think at that point he was starting to show signs of perhaps decline in his health. He was cared for, like you said before. His mother obviously must have, you know, maybe travelled to St. Ives to look after him, or moved to St. Ives for a little while. So he was there, and that was. There's not, again, I didn't find too much information about St. Ives. I don't know if there's any examples of work from that period, but it's interesting, you know, because obviously a lot of there's such an artist established, you know, colonies and groups of artists that are associated with St. Ives as well, and the fact he was there for a period is really interesting within itself, to be honest with you.
Yes, I mean, I did actually find that they were staying at a place called the Retreat, which suggests it's a place for people who are not feeling too well. You know, he definitely didn't go there, I think, for the artistic sort of side of things. You know, he was there. I think he'd been ill for some time in London, and his mum, as I said, was never too far away from him. You know, wherever he was staying with friends, whatever. His mum used to have a sort of flat or house nearby that she rented, and she decided, I think, to take him away from London, because obviously, you know, it's quite a polluted city at that time, a growing city, and so she decided to take him to St. Ives, and they stayed at this place called the Retreat. But there's no real evidence that he did any painting down there. I mean, there are paintings of the coast at St. Ives, but not a great deal, really.
Yeah. Okay.
I think he was there really to recuperate. I mean, and then there are a couple of surviving letters that he did write, you know, from St. Ives. But as you said, you know, he didn't sort of churn out paintings there in the same way that he was doing, you know, on these trips abroad.
That's interesting. And then, was he visiting home at all then? Did he go back to Wales quite a lot after London? Was he sort of, did he come, you know, did he go back in between and things like that?
Yes. You know, he was back home from time to time, and there are surviving letters of that he's written to friends. In fact, there's a letter here from, I don't know if you want me to read it out. It's from,
go for it.
Where are we?
You're very well prepared.
Here we are. This was actually written from the house in Old Road, which was, as I said, was Orchard Croft. This was written in June 1908, 09.
Okay.
And this is actually to John Fothergill. You'll have to excuse me. This is my transcript of his writing. And Dear Fothergill, thanks for your nice long letter I got this morning. Mother got to check all right and says she is sorry not to have written. She is very occupied with preparations for autumn tour. Now, I don't know whether that was a tour to do with Innes, you know, where she was helping out or not.
Yeah.
She doesn't go into detail. Papa is quite well. That's John Innes, of course, the author of Old Llanelli. Sometimes getting a headache when he abuses everyone and says that all those who try to make him happy are the biggest lot of fools anyone ever had to live with. At other times going off into dreamlands of geology and astronomy, where it is wonderful to follow him. He tells me that with present telescopes, they can see the moon as if it were only 30 miles away, and that there are great canals across Mars as if the life on it were making a last effort to collect water to keep itself alive, as it is all dry except at the poles. According to Newton, it is inevitable for Earth to dry out in this way by sucking their own moisture into themselves, and Mars is older than us, so more dry. I shall be in London next Wednesday. I was going to spring this upon you, but fearing you might go away, I thought safer to tell you, as I want very much to see you there. I'm going to be looked at by Dr. Tebb to let him see how I am getting on. This is a secret, as I only want to see you and Derwent, please. I will be living with Mother in Bayswater, I think, for a week. I want no money now or at any time for watercolour. Always being pleased to let you take charge of my babies, as I really do believe you see more in the ugly-faced brats than I do. I have written to Lys, telling him of some places, one a farm of my father's, near home, which I think would suit him, and so to work. And goodbye till Wednesday. I am doing a number of pictures which are very difficult. Ever yours, D. I think, that letter in itself says quite a lot. The fact that his mum was, he's very close to his mum.
That covers everything. That covers a lot. That's brilliant.
It does. And it's kind of it's sad the way he thinks of his own paintings, really, as brats, but I think he probably underestimated some of his works. I mean, he wasn't very good at figurative work. I mean, at his own admission, he just couldn't paint faces and people, the human form, which is why I think he sort of concentrated on landscape more. And where he has got human figures, they seem to be just plonked in, really, usually Euphemia lamb.
They kind of look a bit naive, a little bit childlike, almost, some of the figures and stuff. And and they do sort of, like you say, they just sort of sit perhaps a bit awkwardly sometimes in the landscape. It's quite, they're interesting to see them, of course. With regards to Innes's appearance as an artist, I gather that there's only one photograph of him, I think, if that sort of seems right. There's one that I've seen. It's documented somewhere that there's one photograph of him. And obviously there is paintings of him. I know Augustus John did a painting of him, and then somebody else, I think, did a portrait of him as well. I've heard he's quite bohemian in the way he dressed, with black coat and things like that. Yeah, it's quite interesting, really, that, there are more paintings of Innes than there are actually photographs. Because when you think of the people that he used to mix with, and the fact that he used to go to art exhibitions, it is amazing, and photography at that time, the early part of the 20th century, was coming into its own. Yeah. It just amazes me that there is only the one photograph of Innes. And, I've discussed this with John Hoole, who actually, did a lot of research for his book. And, he said himself that, that was the only photo that he could come across. And that photo in itself, it's very similar to the painting portrait of Innes, which was painted by his friend Ian Strang. If you put the two side by side, well, they can overlap. So I reckon possibly Ian Strang took that photo and used it as the sort of basis for his painting. Yes, when you think, as I said, there must be some more photographs out there, but I haven't come across any. Certainly within the family, you think that, with the type of family that he grew up in, you would imagine that there'd be certainly family photographs, with the group of the family together and things like that. It's a strange sort of thing, but obviously maybe that's what happened. Maybe there just is no other. But time will tell. Maybe some will come out of the woodwork in the future. Who knows?
Yes, I mean, and possibly, the family, when they eventually sort of died out, I haven't been able to find any descendants or anything. There might have been little photograph albums that they end up on the skip at that time. Unappreciated. They were living in Whitchurch in Tavistock at that time. But when you think that he also had a trip across Spain with quite a rich sort of Lord Howard de Walden. They went for a trip across Spain together. Howard de Walden was driving his sports car, and he took Innes with him. They went all the way down to South Spain. You'd think that sort of even someone, because Howard de Walden, he was the owner of Chirk Castle. Rich beyond belief. And you'd think even someone like him might have had the sort of, a camera at that time to sort of record their trip. But, there's just no evidence anywhere that, people around him even took photos, and that, he's not even in the background of any photos of Augustus John that you find from that time.
Yeah, that's true.
You were saying about his appearance. Very, very much. He was recorded, I think, by one of his the family servants was interviewed many years ago when they lived in. She was a servant there with the family in Orchard Croft, and she describes Innes as a sort of foppish character. Sort of big floppy hat, long overcoat, and a sort of a cane. And in fact, if you look in some of his paintings, he's actually included himself. Yeah. In the background, small little figure. There's a couple of paintings of him, and he's exactly the same in each of these paintings. And it is with this sort of long floppy hat and a long coat, exactly as he's described and was described also by Augustus John himself.
Yes, yeah, I've seen the Augustus John portrait of him as well, and that with the big hat and
that's it.
well.
Yes,
that's it.
Yeah. I think he would have stuck out internationally.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right. Right. We'll start talking about. There's a lady that was important to Innes's life. The love of his life, I suppose. Is it Euphemia Lamb? He wrote poetry about her and whatever, and then he met her in Paris in 1910, and then they went on a bit of a road trip together into the south of France. I've heard that was she dancing or something? Is that sort of seems right? And he was painting and things like that. And
yes, apparently sort of another trip which there's no photographic evidence of or whatever. But yeah, a trip that they paid for on their way by. She would do dancing in bars and things. He was probably drinking at the table nearby, but he would sort of give his paintings away as well. So, who knows how many paintings there are in France, sort of, painted by Innes that were just given away. And
that's crazy to think that, isn't it? Imagine if you just came across one one day.
It is.
But she was an interesting character, Euphemia. She was actually born not a million miles away from me. I mean, she was born in Ormskirk in Lancashire, and she was brought up in Greenhays, which was it's in South Manchester. I'm in North Manchester, but not too far away. And she married another Australian artist called Henry Lamb. Literally, there's scope for a book about her as a character herself, because she was really bohemian, and she married Henry Lamb. After she met him in Manchester, I think Henry Lamb was studying at medical college or something like that. They went to London, married. She was pregnant, and then I think she had a miscarriage. But they had married. But then she was a really interesting character. She became a life model, of course, and was a life model for Augustus John. That's the connection with John and various other artists. I think Jacob Epstein, the sculptures of her, and these various other artists but she was quite perhaps a promiscuous character, a bohemian character, and sort of had a real lust for life as a person. So obviously he met her. They went around, went in Paris, and then they went down to South France together. Obviously, Innes had a real connection with her, and she was deemed as the love of his life.
Oh, definitely so. I mean, it may have been more from his point of view than her, because, as you said, she was quite a, promiscuous young lady.
Yes.
But there's a parallel as well in the fact that there are so few photos of her. When you consider that, as you said, she was painted by the likes of Augustus John, Ambrose McAvoy. She was an artist model. She was sculptured by Jacob Epstein. But there are very few photos, if any at all, of her at that particular time, if you like, at the peak of her fame. Yeah. I did come across a picture of her with Augustus John in later years, but that is and in fact I found her grave as well.
Did you? Right.
Yeah. Not personally, I found a photograph of it.
Right. Okay.
But yes, they seem to be well suited to each other, and as you said, she would join them later in North Wales.
That's right. I mean, obviously she was married to Henry Lamb, but by the time she'd met Innes, they'd kind of separated. I gather from it was a few years after perhaps that had sort of happened. So obviously they were together for a little while. But then around 1910 as well. So this is sort of 1910 time. Innes, who you mentioned earlier, did know Augustus John through the fact that he was his teacher at the Slade. They became very, closer friends, if that sort of seems right. I mean, I don't know if there's perhaps correspondence between them or whatever, but they did sort of become closer friends. And of course, Augustus John at that time was older. I think he was 9 years older than Innes. Innes would have been about in his early 20s, 23, and John was about 32. John was a celebrated artist at that point, perhaps famous at that, throughout the nation. And Innes wasn't at all as famous. But Innes wrote to John and told him about Wales and wanting him to come, because obviously Augustus John is from Wales, and wanting him to come to Wales and paint together in this area that Innes had discovered. I mean, this is all these things that must have been going on in Innes's mind at this point. He met Euphemia. He'd been to so many times. He'd been to France, and he'd with the Fauves, and thought of the Fauves and the way that they painted. And I think it was sort of melting into his brain that he wanted to get out into the Welsh landscape and bring what he'd learnt from his time in France into the landscape in Wales. And so he was looking for the perfect area or the perfect motif to do that. And of course, then he discovered Arenig, which is where the story unfolds from there, if you like.
Yes, in fact, on the occasion that as you said, Innes sort of tried to convince Augustus John did join him in Wales. I think Innes must have arranged to meet Augustus John at his home in Llanelli. But when Augustus John arrived in Llanelli, he was told by Innes's parents that, Innes, he's already left and gone up to North Wales. So, he's pretty sort of much,
Yeah, he couldn't ring him on his mobile phone, could he, at that point,
No. And when you think of what the transport links must have been like in sort of Wales at that time, I mean, quite an effort to get up to North Wales.
Yeah.
But, as you said, he did eventually find his way up. Augustus John found his way up to sort of North Wales, and he met up with Innes up there. And, Innes had already started painting, and he found an inn to stay at, Provenance, and Augustus John joined him there. They sort of had rooms booked there. It was quite a wild inn or pub. The landlord himself was quite well known as a mine host kind of thing, probably along the lines of John Fothergill.
He had a fantastic name, didn't he? The landlord had a fantastic. Was it Washington or something? I think he was called.
It is. Yeah, I think it's Washington Davies. I think
Washington Davies. Sure. What a name!
Yeah, I'd have to check on that. And that farm actually is featured in the Mountain That Had to Be Painted documentary on the BBC. It's now a farmhouse. I think they actually show the original toilets. But anyway, so they shacked up there, Augustus and James, and James showed him the sort of mountain views that he'd sort of discovered, which was Arenig, of course, the peaks of Arenig. And if you've ever been up Arenig, actually, the first time I went there, I was sort of looking around, sort of, where are these peaks? Because it's a lot flatter.
Yeah.
Again, we said how much he used to accentuate these mountain peaks when he was down in south of France. Well, the peaks that you see in some of Innes's paintings are far greater than, the actuality of the scene. Arenig is quite a sort of broad, flat mountain, but, the twin peaks they used to paint, they're quite prominent. They used to go out in all weathers, really. I mean, that obviously didn't help sort of Innes's deteriorating health at that time.
Yeah.
But Augustus John, he'd set up his easel and he'd start painting away slowly, by which time sort of Innes had painted about 3 or 4 paintings and was ready to move on. And it was around, it was during that period that sort of Augustus John started adapting his style towards, the younger Innes's style.
Yes,
he wanted to try and keep up with Innes, if you like. And you can see a change in, John's paintings at that time as well. They became more simplified as well, in order to just sort of quickly capture the scene and then move on and sort of, the light up in that area changes so quickly. And I think that was in his, he wanted to capture a certain moment in time. And then he's ready to do the next painting. A lot of them, the famous one of Arenig, which you probably know about, which is in the Tate Museum.
Yes.
I mean, that is like the sort of peak of his painting career. If you ever see that at the Tate itself, you can look at sort of prints and everything like that. But to see it on the Tate, it was obviously a studio painting because it's a huge painting. But the colours are wonderful. But for most of the period time, he was painting on little sort of wooden pallets, which he, just tucked under his arm and.
It's fantastic. I mean, like you say about John, obviously Augustus John had been to France as well, and had perhaps been influenced as well by Fauvism. But then, like you say, the fact he was with this, this younger painter, and I think Augustus John prided himself on being, quick with his ability and a quick painter. But then he must have seen Innes and thought, bloody hell, this guy's just, he's just smashing these paintings out. And I think, like you've perfectly described it there. I think Innes was perhaps, obviously fearful of his own health at that point, as we will sort of talk about a little bit later on, of course, what was going on with Innes. He wasn't a well guy at all, and not been well since childhood. Of course, they were drinking lots. They were spending the days painting and then going back to the where they were staying and drinking in these these sort of times. But then Innes was painting sort of quickly to capture the moment. Exactly what you said. He's painting. He's wanting to. If you look at a mountain, for example, and you see even the way the clouds will just go over a mountain, it'll just shift the whole landscape within a matter of seconds. It'll change from perhaps being a particular view of a mountain with clouds and then suddenly it flips and you're in shade and it's completely changed and it's gone. And so he's trying to get this down as quickly as possible, but using these bright colors and this jewel-like quality in his paintings. It's fantastic. And like you say, Innes was doing this, and Augustus John some people can describe it when you get these artists together doing this sort of work, because of course they were joined at one point by Derwent. Some people maybe call it a brief school of painting, if you like, because it was a couple of years that they did this for. It was late 1910, I think, is when the initial sort of perhaps idea was set up, and they did it in 1911 and 1912. They were there as well. Yeah, they were there for a couple of years, and then they didn't always stay in the pub, did they? They found a cottage or something. Is that right? Is that what they did?
Yes, they eventually found a cottage, and at that time, then sort of. They were joined by a whole entourage of Augustus John's extended family, his wife. Augustus John was very much into gypsy law, and his wife, Aurelia. Yeah. I think she was from a gypsy family, but who knows how many children Augustus John had. even at that time, it said that even he didn't know how many children he had, and if he met a child in the street, he would pat them on the head in case they were one of his. So you had all these wives and girlfriends sort of milling around, and the parties. It must have been a pretty wild existence up there.
Wild time. I mean, and like you say, the paintings that these guys were producing there at this time as well. It's such an interesting time in British art, because that period, 1910, it was the first sort of, there was an exhibition in London of post-impressionist at the same time that Innes was up painting these works, and this exhibition was actually after Innes had started painting these sort of paintings, and this exhibition included the leading post-impressionists, many of which were obviously were dead by that time actually, but the fact that Innes had obviously he'd done his time, studying this sort of work and been in France, and then wanting to bring it back to, I think the fact that he brought it to Wales of all places, it's that in itself is kind of revolutionary in British art. Absolutely, it's so early in that sort of period of British art to be doing these sort of paintings. It's a fantastic thing. It's a real sort of seminal moment in British painting, is what I sort of see. With these guys, and obviously they like drinking as well and enjoying themselves, I think.
They did, yeah. And I was fortunate enough to meet Keith Bowen, who's the artist who's got an interest in his lives up in North Wales, and he features in the mountain that had to be painted, and he took me around that area, and he was able to show me the actual sort of the actual spots where Innes and John would have sat to compose some of these paintings. And you can actually, even down to the actual boulder, which they features in sort of Boy by Pool, Arenig, 1912. You can see the boulder, and you can, it's definitely that boulder with the stream. It's just amazing to sit on these spots on, the waterfalls just nearby, which are kind of not far off the main road, but if you didn't know about them, you would just drive past them. It's just amazing. The art that came out of that area.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to go. I'll have to visit Arenig at some point. I'd love to go up it. I've never. You've obviously gone up. You've climbed, haven't you? I believe, is that right?
I haven't climbed to the top. I'd love to climb to the top because the top in itself. I mean, that's got a story because. Innes is supposedly buried a casket of love letters that he had from Euphemia up the top on the summit. But unfortunately, an American bomber sort of smashed into the summit during the Second World War and took, a couple of feet off its height. So if ever there was a casket there, I mean, it would probably been smashed to bits. Yeah. But whether that's a true story or not.
It's a nice sort of story, isn't it? It's kind of one of those things that'll never be sort of proved one way or the other, if you like. No. So John, with regards to Innes's work itself, he's doing these paintings from a commercial standpoint, looking at what galleries he might have been showing in, etc. Augustus John did introduce Innes's work to an American collector around this time, a guy called John Quinn. that in turn led to Innes's work being shown, I think, in America. Is that sort of right? And then obviously that was, to sort of show that what he was producing was appreciated and was part of this whole dynamic of well, it was purely post-impressionism what he was painting, really, but and so he was included in an important exhibition, if that's right.
Yes, I think it's called the Armory Show, and it was a major exhibition organised by this chap called Quinn, who was an American lawyer, a solicitor with a big interest in art, and for that exhibition they brought over many European sort of artists' paintings, including Britain, of course, and Augustus John had recommended Innes, and so some of his paintings were exhibited, which probably accounts for the reasons why some of his paintings have ended up in, art galleries over in America.
Yeah.
I mean, Innes is in galleries all over the world, but, you can see how they might have travelled, across to America.
That's it. Yeah, I mean, that show, it had works by Van Gogh, it had Monet's, it had, Gwen John, of course, Augustus John's extremely famous and incredible sister had work in there as well. So yeah, it's good to see that, the work that they were painting was sort of appreciated to the level and getting to a nationally, important exhibition. It's fantastic, and that's the way, it should have been, really. So obviously after this had happened, so he was there a couple of years in Wales with Augustus John, and they were friends with a lot of the gypsies, the local Welsh gypsies, and there's Romanies around the area. Is that sort of right? Is that right as well? That's what I've heard?
It is. I mean, Innes always had a fascination with gypsies. Because going back, I mentioned earlier the furnace quarry. Up here, up the road. Well, there was, that was well known to have that had a gypsy encampment.
Right. Okay.
At the time that the Innes family lived here, there were gypsy encampments up around the old furnace reservoir, and there are photographs of that encampment that you can see today. So, he was always aware of, gypsy lore and gypsy life.
Yeah.
And he has, I think there are a couple of little sketches that he did of the gypsies up at Furness, but so he always had that joint interest, if you like, with Augustus John, of gypsy life, gypsy folklore, and the gypsy society.
Oh, that's interesting. So then later on, obviously, his health was continuing to deteriorate, unfortunately. In 1914, he went to Brighton and was cared for by his mother. And then at that point, he was visited by John and Henry Cole and Frank Slade, I think was the other guy who was there. That was in 1914. And then, of course, he moved to nursing home then in Kent, which was in 1914 as well. And again, he was cared for by his mother and visited by, Augustus John, Henry Cole. And then Euphemia came, I think, didn't she?
I think, according to the stories, Euphemia was, the love of his life, was one of the last to visit him and see him alive. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, he'd gone abroad to Tenerife when he was, really ill. He thought the sort of the warm, dry air would cure him, but he was actually taken ill there. And his brother was given time off from his job in the Navy to go out to Tenerife and bring James back to Britain. And as you said, he sort of stayed at rooms in Brighton. There's always this kind of, I wonder, sort of, who was kind of in control of his life at that time. He was obviously sort of so weak, but you've got these sort of artistic friends looking after him and doing things, and then you've got his family as well, and you wonder, did they work together sort of in his last days, or were they sort of who was taking control of his life at the end of the day? Because it seems that his funeral was actually organized by Augustus John and Cole. There's no mention of his family being involved in the funeral arrangements.
That's interesting.
It just seemed a bit strange. And, that Augustus John, they were arranging for visits from the likes of Euphemia, but his family seemed to be in the background. And, to that extent that, his family were actually, they'd left Llanelli at that time. They were living in Whitchurch near Tavistock down in Cornwall. And I always find it strange that he sort of, as you said, he was in a nursing home in Kent. The fact that he was buried in Kent, in Dartford, and not brought back at least to sort of Whitford, where the family had made their home, if not Llanelli. I find that a bit strange. And as you know, he was later exhumed and reburied in the family grave in Dartford. So I find it strange that the funeral seemed to have happened quite quickly.
Yeah.
In Dartford, where he had, there was no connection with Dartford.
Yeah.
At that time. But having said that, First World War was looming.
Mm-hmm.
It might have been sort of difficult to make arrangements for things at that time, because he literally died 1 month away from the outbreak of the First World War. So it might have been difficult to arrange sort of
course. Yeah,
transportation and funeral sort of things at that time. But,
I mean, he died. So it's tuberculosis. He sadly died from, and that was on the 22nd of August, 1914. And as you said, he was aged 27 when he sadly died, which is, of course, it's a ridiculously young age. And he achieved clearly so much in that the amount of the work he produced. I mean, they're quite rare, obviously, because I don't know how many oils must actually survive, whether there is there must be an amount of that people do know. I know occasionally they do come up for sale and stuff, but they are quite rare, aren't they? There's not mountains of these works around.
No, but of course a lot of them are in, even when you look at the reproductions in John Hoole's book, he's been able to sort of get hold of private owners to sort of reproduce some of those images, because, as you said, there are some in galleries around the world, but primarily they're sort of in private ownership. I mean, his works were owned by the likes of Sir Noel Coward, Charlie Chaplin. These are big names in the world of show business and whatever. There was even a former Wimbledon champion, Bunny Guinness, I think his name, who owned one of his works. Used to play tennis with Charlie Chaplin, so he probably recommended this new artist to Charlie Chaplin, and Charlie Chaplin decided to invest.
There you go.
But over time, some of the works, they come out of this private ownership, and you see them up for auction. The one Noel Coward owned a work called Camden Town at Night.
Right. Okay.
And that came up for auction about 5 or 6 years ago. Mm-hmm. Probably around the time of the centenary, when there was a lot of activity, and the people were looking at their collections and thinking, so this is who this guy is, and perhaps the family had just thought, this is a good time to sort of perhaps put it up for auction or whatever. So they have been coming on the market slowly. One of his final works, which was actually it was never sold originally. It was found in Augustus John's studio after Augustus John's death, and it was called The Crucifixion, but it's known to be one of the last works of Innes. Quite a sad painting. It just shows literally it's of Jesus on the cross. But it seems to be set against a sort of a Welsh mountain view. It's quite a poignant picture. But again, the figures are, they're very poorly sort of executed, their figures. But that came up for auction out of, private ownership. And someone in London actually got in touch with me through the Facebook page. They knew I had that Facebook page.
Yes.
And they wanted to know a bit more information on it, which I was able to provide him with. And then after the auction, he sort of got in touch with me and said he was lucky enough to be successful at the auction.
Wow.
And he was now the proud owner.
Fantastic.
Of that painting. And actually, he's a Llanelli. He's from Llanelli himself, so it's nice to see these things going
definitely
full circle. He actually lives in London, but he said, if ever you need it on loan for whatever.
Oh, that's lovely.
But it's nice to know that, where these paintings are going, and that, trying to keep tabs really on where they are.
Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, I mean, like you say, that painting, it was quite it's an emotional painting, because it must have, like you say, it's one of the last paintings that he produced, and it was towards the end of his life, and he kind of must have felt his own mortality at that point, and did this crucifixion scene. So yeah, it's a real, and it's the only work of its type, isn't it? Really, with that sort of using that sort of crucifixion. Certainly, there's nothing sort of similar to that he ever painted. So it's that sort of brings us to the end of his life, and what's obviously there's been lots of exhibitions since then, hasn't there? Have you managed to see many of those and things?
I managed to see the centenary exhibition up in Cardiff, in the National Gallery, Cardiff, where they brought together quite a few of his works. Unfortunately, they didn't produce a catalogue, but it was nice certainly to see in the flesh, if you like, these paintings that I'd been otherwise on the internet, because some of them that you think are small paintings are actually quite large. They were obviously painted in the studio.
In the studio,
and you mentioned those paintings in Manchester. There's a lot of detail in some of those larger paintings, but and there's been a couple of local sort of paintings by Carmarthenshire County Council of the paintings they own. I mean, what I would like is to see a more permanent display in Llanelli. Llanelli doesn't really kind of recognise him as an artist. I think probably in Llanelli, his father, as the author of Old Llanelli, is probably better known.
Really? Right.
So, I mean, that was one of the reasons I set up that page, really. The Facebook page is to try and raise awareness. And, of course, one of the things I was trying to do is purchase one of his paintings himself. I thought,
of course, yeah.
Because he was, becoming well known, obviously the prices of the paintings rise, and they do fetch. I've been looking at the prices. I mean, they go upward to about 25,000, 50,000 at auction these days. But I was lucky enough. I mean, I'm always Googling his name, and about 3 years ago, it came up with an image of a painting by James Dickson Innes. It was called A Lake View, and it was being sold on eBay in America.
Right.
And this caught my eye, and I thought that does look remarkably like Innes's trees or whatever.
Yeah.
And clearly the people in America who were selling it didn't have a clue who Innes was.
Yeah.
But they had, importantly, it was an unsigned picture, but, I recognized the style straight away. And they had a picture as well on the eBay site of the back of the painting.
Right.
And it clearly matched some of the known paintings, in this country that are on display now. It was clearly marked a lake view, and it had a number which appeared to be like an old catalogue number.
Yeah, okay.
And the mount and the frames were the same as a painting he did of Chepstow Castle.
Right.
And I just looked into it in more detail, and I sort of sent a picture, a picture of a screenshot to John Hoole, and I said, "What do you think? What do you think about this? Is it worth a punt?" And he said, "It was unsigned, but it was clearly, probably by Innes. But he said it's definitely not a lake view. If you look at a painting he's got, a known oil painting he's got in, I think it's Brighton and Hove Museum. It's actually called the Seine at Corderbeck, where the River Seine bends, and actually does look like a lake, but it's actually, as I said, a bend in the river.
Right.
It's a huge oil painting, and when you looked at this watercolor and the painting that's in Hove Gallery, they were a perfect match. You could cut one in half, and superimpose it on the other half, and it just everything fitted.
Yes,
and it was almost as like this was a watercolor that he possibly did on the spot. And there is another known watercolor as well of the same scene, and then he possibly went back to the studio and did the big oil painting version, which as I said is on display in Brighton Gallery. So I thought, well, they were only asking they were only asking £500. I happen to have a bit of savings. I did ask them for more information as to where they had got it from, and they just said, well, they'd had it in the gallery for quite a few years, and it had never sold, but they had originally bought it from a house auction sale in Upper New York, on the outskirts of New York.
Right.
And this kind of fitted in as well with the sort of armory show exhibition where Innes's works might have been brought across. So I just thought, right, I'm going to go for it, and they accepted the offer, and it came about 2 months later through the post.
Wow.
They did say, well, we're going to have to take the glass out because of shipping.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So, when it came, I mean, you just could see straight away it was of that era, the way paper mottles a bit.
Yeah, and, of course. Yeah.
It was from that period, and, it was, 99.9% it's in Innes.
Oh, it is Innes. It is Innes. Fantastic.
So I had it reframed in museum style glass, and I said, look, this the frame and everything looks a bit busted, but it's essential that we keep the frame and the backing, because it's all part of the provenance.
Of course, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Of the painting. So I had it done, and it's proudly on display in my front room. So that's as I said, fun sign, but it's the nearest I'll get to owning an Innes. But it's nice that it's back in his hometown.
Definitely. Anyway. Well done to you. That's I applaud you for that. That's excellent.
Yeah.
Well deserved as well, because obviously, the time and like you say, the prices have continue to go up, and it's because of people like you that the prices do go up.
Probably. And the BBC, and with the latest series with Hugh Stevens.
Yes.
Some Welsh artists might go up again. Even.
Yeah, that's true.
As a result of that, because that obviously it's available on iPlayer.
Yeah, that's so it's this Welsh art series, and they've done it over the course of time, haven't they? So they started off in more medieval sort of times and whatnot, and then they brought it up to sort of more modern art. Yeah. There's a few artists, obviously. They only have time constraints and everything else with the program and whatnot. But there's obviously these various artists that I think, God, I wish they would have mentioned this artist. I wish they would have mentioned this artist. But obviously they do what they can do. I mean, they didn't mention people like Joseph Herman, for example, and various who weren't necessarily naturally, they weren't Welsh, but they were sort of, and there's various other painters, of course, that they didn't mention. But yeah, it was interesting to see, and it's on there. I love that. So and like you say, there's plenty of people who watched that and thought, well, I'll go and have a look at Innes and I'll just check him out, and that's what it does, isn't it? The power of the.
I think so. I think these days with sort of programs like Fake or Fortune and Britain's Lost Masterpieces. I mean, there's definitely an increase in interest in art, and I think some people are looking at it as a kind of source of investment. Who is going to be the next. Big artists, to look out for, kind of thing. Even modern artists. But one of the, going back to Innes's death, I mean, one of the unfortunate things is, from our point of view, is the fact that he is buried in Whitchurch. Because when I went down there to look for his grave, I was asking, where is he actually buried, and they don't really know about Innes down there, because I mean, the family only lived there for a year or two off and on, and it was the mother who bought the house originally, and then the father joined them on when he retired from his job in Llanelli. They were living as a family there. The mother was there first, then the husband John has joined. James was never really sort of hardly ever lived there. He just used to sort of have the occasional visit, but the fact that he was exhumed and reburied there naturally with the parents. It's a pity, I think he'd have been more appreciated if his grave was in Llanelli, or the family grave, than it is down there, because they don't know about Innes in Whitchurch, really. But,
Yeah, that's what it is, isn't it? That's part of the story, I suppose, isn't it?
It is, yeah. But at least, it's quite a sort of substantial sort of family headstone. It's not in a neglected part of the cemetery, I mean, it seems to be well looked after, the cemetery as a whole.
Well, thank you for today. I mean, it's really inspired me to go to Erenig at some point, and I need to do it and see if I can find some of these the exact locations. There's the waterfall painting, which I don't think we talked about too much. There's a particular waterfall watercolor which is mentioned in the program, that is mentioned in the Mountain Art. That's a stunning painting, and obviously the guy can't remember the guy who's in the program, he goes to the site, doesn't he, of where it is,
Keith,
where the water
Keith
is it Keith that was it Keith who did that?
Okay.
And that's that looked like a great location, because you can see exactly as it's painted. You can pick out the rocks and you can sort of see it. So yeah, I'd love to. You've inspired me to go and do that, I think.
Yeah. Well, there are actually two versions of that waterfall. They're very much alike, but the colours are just slightly different.
Yes.
But as you said, they're stunning sort of watercolours, and it's not far off the main road. Going from Bala to Trausfynydd, it's not far off the main road. It's just that if you don't know about it, you have
no chance.
You'd miss it completely.
They're not signposted.
No.
No, we do go to North Wales quite a bit. This is I've absolutely love Wales, you see, so we do go quite a bit to North Wales, so maybe I'll have to sort of have a jaunt over to it at some point and see what we can do, see if we can go out on a trail and see if we can find some stuff. But thank you very much for doing this, and it's been amazing. It's been really interesting and very insightful, and hopefully you've enjoyed it as well.
I have. I hope you can make sense of some of the
No, it's been brilliant. It's been great. Thank you very much, and I'll be in touch soon, and all the best to you, and have a brilliant week, rest of the weekend.
And you, all the best. Thanks.
All right, look after yourself, mate.
All the best. And you. Cheers. Bye.
I really enjoyed recording the episode, and I hope that you've enjoyed listening to it. It's something that I've been wanting to do for a while. I'm a big fan of James Dickson Innes, and I think that he was a groundbreaking artist, really. At that time, sort of 1910, 11, 12, he was a real pioneer, because so much of the art that was produced in Britain really was much more traditional at that time. There were some artists painting in an impressionistic way, but Innes and Augustus John and Derwent had moved on from that onto more post-impressionistic works, of course with Innes's influences from France, what he'd learned in France. Innes died very young, whereas Augustus John went on to become a very well-known portrait artist, perhaps never having that spark of originality that he'd achieved with his time with Innes ever again, really, in his career. Derwent had suffered from mental health problems. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1912, and that eventually saw him confined to asylums in Surrey from 1918 until he died in 1931 in Epsom. As Martin mentioned, there are some excellent examples of works by James Dickson Innes in public collections in this country. You can check them out online. Also, works by Augustus John from that period you can find, and in fact works by Derwent as well. The John Hull book is quite difficult to get hold of, really. I hope they do another edition of it at some point, but time will tell. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. As usual, I'll post some images relating to the episode on the Northern Art Facebook page and on the Instagram page too. Any likes, comments, shares, messages, follows, etc. is always appreciated. You can also subscribe to the channel on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts, and then you won't miss out on any episodes that I upload in the future.